Welcome to the RAS Project, a conversation about life, entrepreneurship, personal development, family, tech, and marketing. My name is Ivan Temelkov, and I'm your host. What's in this podcast for you? Here you will grasp life-changing advice to help you level up in every aspect of your life and business, to help you reach your goals and dreams. And as always, all content is 100% real, raw, and unfiltered. Today, I'm joined by another guest on the podcast by the name of Cal Wilder, who is extremely passionate about helping small business owners take control of their finances. Cal, how's it going?
Great. I'm happy to be with you, Ivan.
Awesome. Okay, that has to be one of the best bios I think that I've heard in quite a while because it's straight to the point. It's so concise, and I love it. So let's start out with, tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and how did you get into what you're doing today?
Yeah, sure. So I'm kind of a lifelong learner, and I've kind of stumbled into entrepreneurship and spent most of my career running and working and supporting with small businesses of all kinds. And so, I've developed a lot of empathy for small business owners because I've seen that too many of them are really struggling. They're not making the kind of money they hoped to be making when they started their business. They don't know why that is, and they don't really know what to do about it. And so those are the kinds of business owners we're trying to help. Me
Uh,
personally, when I consult with them, and my company when we do it.
Awesome. So you mentioned a couple of things that I think a lot of newcomers to the entrepreneurial game don't understand is just that, there really isn't sort of a book to success in entrepreneurship. There's a lot of struggles. There's a lot of risks, a lot of sacrifices. There's a lot of failures, really, in entrepreneurship. So, you were talking about, helping businesses and entrepreneurs. Let's talk specifically more about how do you help those entrepreneurs? What are some ways that you help them guide them through the entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah, so as you said, there's a lot that goes into being an entrepreneur, and I'm focused more on the finance side of things, although certainly learned a lot over the years and decades when it comes to marketing and sales and growth and operations management. My career has mostly been in finance and operations, so that's where I can add the most value to businesses. And I kind of laid out my approach recently. I've kind of developed it over the last 20 years of working with hundreds of small businesses and realized, there's only so many that I can work with personally, right? And I really want to help a lot more of them than I personally can. And so, kind of laid out what has been in my head that's been developed over the years into a book called The Financial Operating System. And that's what we use at my company, SmartBooks, when we go in to consult with small businesses. And it's also available, for those who want to kind of self-implement on a do-it-yourself basis. But we go through a proven six-step process where business owners first identify why they're in business, what they're trying to accomplish, and then ultimately go through a process and develop and apply some financial metrics and management systems in the business. And then they can monitor their financial performance and actually understand how the business is performing financially. Sometimes this is the first time small businesses have ever really understood how their businesses are performing month after month and kind of been in a position to be able to drive the metrics that move them in the direction they want to move.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's really really good because let's face it, a lot of newcomers into the entrepreneurial game are very blind going into this. Things like capital and cash flow and month over month, year over year growth, and you talked about operations. Like most people think that I have a strong passion. Most entrepreneurs, and that's going to help you make money. Well, sure it will, but there's a lot more nuances to that than just saying you're great at marketing or you're great at business or you're great at sales, right? That's just not going to cut it. So you talked about the financial operating system, which is a proven process. What specific things, or does that system teach entrepreneurs? Is there anything specific that you focus on, or is it kind of like a blanket approach to, a guidance into entrepreneurship and finances?
Yeah, I mean, if we distill it down, the first thing we want to do is have the business owner define what they're trying to accomplish with their business. What does success look like to them? And then we define a set of performance metrics that reflect performance against those objectives. And we measure that and report back on that. And you can iterate and improve and make business decisions geared around those metrics that reflect how you're performing against your goals. So ultimately, at its core, there's a lot of focus on metrics and scorecards and reporting. But before we can even get to the point of defining the right metrics for the business, we've got to understand what you're really trying to accomplish. Are you looking to grow the business? Are you looking to eventually be able to sell it? Are you looking to be able to transition it to your children? Is growth really important to you and you're willing to sacrifice, profitability now? What are you really trying to accomplish with the business? How much risk are you willing to take, right? Are you willing to personally guarantee a bank loan in order to invest in something or buy some assets? Or is that level of risk just too much for you at this point in your career or your life, right? So it's really getting the business owner to figure out what they really want first of all, and then we figure out the metrics after that.
Sure. No, that's an excellent point too that you mentioned because you said success and growth. And I think that most entrepreneurs, especially new ones that are coming to the game, is they just think that it's about making money and fame and they think that their business is going to skyrocket overnight. And that is so far from the reality, right? So let's talk a little bit about, what are some things, some specific ways, that you go about, helping entrepreneurs in terms of, okay, let's say, first you have to define what the success means. Let's say you want to make a lot of money, right? Which is what the vast majority of entrepreneurs want is they just want more money, right? Is how do I get the quickest route from 0 to 100? So what are some tips? What are some tricks maybe or insights that you can share from your experience on, hey, I want to make a lot of money. So how do I go about doing that?
Yeah, so make a lot of money, that really means you want to make a lot of profit, right? So first you've got to understand the difference between sales and profit and cash flow, because ultimately you want cash in your pocket, not reported profit on the income statement. And so kind of understanding the basics of, what do the financial statements mean? What's the difference between revenue and profit? And then kind of once you get that basic understanding, we get into thinking about the strategy in the business model. And I define strategy as the choices that a business makes in the marketplace that are different than the competition, that allows them to win market share in their target market against the competition. So when you go into business, you're doing the same thing that everybody else is doing. Why is the customer going to buy from you? It's kind of a coin toss, who they're going to work with. And you're new
Hmm.
and other people are more established. So there's got to be a reason why the target market wants to buy from you. So you got to define what your target market is, what's different and compelling about your offering versus the competition, and then what do you need to do in order to deliver on that on that uniqueness and really manage the business around it. So um, most people who start businesses are, great practitioners of something. They're great at sales. They're great at software development. They love landscaping, whatever it is that they love to do. They start the business and they want to do a lot of that. But it's kind of getting them to think about, all right, what's the real business model? What's the strategy? And then once we define that, what are the right metrics that we can use to help assess performance against that strategy?
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned a couple of really interesting things that I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't take into account. I know certainly I haven't. Is that, and I've seen a lot of other entrepreneurs in the game. Some that have been in it for a decade now. Is just that you talked about the fact that being practitioners. So a lot of new entrepreneurs are great practitioners that can execute on things because they have a passion, something that they're very devoted and committed to. Like you said, whether it's marketing or whether it's a landscaping business or maybe you're a plumber or whatever it might be, right? But the challenge with that is that there's usually no business model defined to kind of map out what the long term, path is going to be. And I think that a lot of entrepreneurs, at least I've seen this being a very common problem, is that they sort of oversee that. There's a lack of investment in that because they're led to believe that if I just execute, if I become the best practitioner at my craft, I'm going to be able to beat my competition and achieve profitability and so on and so forth. But one of the things that you mentioned is that you got to have a plan, at some point. And ideally, you got to create that plan when you start, is kind of what I'm hearing you say, correct?
Yeah, or somewhere along the way, whenever you get serious about actually growing the business or becoming more profitable, that can be a catalyst to creating the plan. You might not need a plan if it's just you as a sole proprietor and you're good at your job and people want to hire you. That's great. But when it comes to hiring employees and really growing an enterprise, that's when the plan becomes more important.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because, like I said, a lot of new entrepreneurs, really make these mistakes. I know I've made a lot of these mistakes that you just mentioned, and I think it's kind of essential to when you start out because someone like me is, very eager. I'm very passionate about what I do. I've been doing it for a long time, but doing it for yourself is always different. When you kind of go from a 9 to 5 job, nearly 2 decades, and then start your own business like I did, 4 years ago, is just that as you kind of go through the growth phase, like you said, at some point you really stop to think, you know, how serious do I want to get about this? Like where do I want to invest? Or, do I want to just remain a sole proprietor and just keep doing my own thing? Which I think there's a lot of that right now in what's happening in the world. But like you said, if you want to gain market share, if you want to achieve profitability, cash flow positive and things like that, you really need to look into investing into more of a holistic plan. Developing that business model if you haven't developed one. Because let's face it, I think a lot of people talk about nowadays that with social media and digital, how easy it is to start a business. And true, it is. I mean, all you have to really be is a little bit tech savvy and also somewhat creative, and suddenly you can be creating awareness and interest in the marketplace. But there's a big difference, like you said, between creating interest and awareness as a sole proprietor versus being able to gain market share and being able to achieve profitability long term as a business, not as a sole proprietor, but when you're hiring employees, your first, your second, third, fourth, and so on, and your business starts growing, and suddenly you're like, wait, now I have overhead, now I have expenses, now I have software costs, now I have administrative costs or whatnot. So one thing that I wanted to ask you is, what, in your opinion, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you have seen in your own experience, entrepreneurs and small businesses in the early stages make? And how have you gone about, helping them guide, through those challenges?
Yeah, it's a real tough trade-off and balancing act when you're trying to grow the business beyond being a sole proprietor. And so, I've seen so many small business owners get in the hole financially because they've hired an employee, they've taken office space, they've gotten into long-term, vendor contracts to spend money in advance of sales and too far in advance of sales, and the sales don't materialize at the same rate that they planned, but yet they've committed all of these expenses as if the sales were coming in. And so they start to lose a lot of money. They start to run up credit card debt. They run up their line, they max out their line of credit. They just get in the hole financially. And it's sad
Hmm.
and it's hard though. It's really hard to balance sales and expense, but that's one of the keys when you start to scale, unless you're fortunate enough to have a business model with exponential growth that's attractive to investors and angel investors or venture capitalists, then you have a lot of cash in the bank and you can spend a lot in advance of sales. But for most of us and the vast
Hmm.
majority of small businesses, we're bootstrapping, right? We're probably going without pay to some extent or a below market
Right.
salary for a while. And, we're sinking a lot of blood, sweat, and tears as well as our own money into the business. And so, balancing, where you spend the money and not
Hmm.
spending it too far in advance of sales. But at the other end, you often have to spend something to set up some infrastructure to be able to scale. So just balancing the two is the hardest
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah, and that's a really good point because, like you said, front loading a lot of that. I think too many entrepreneurs get excited in the beginning, and I feel like with business, it's a long term game. You really got to pace yourself. It definitely takes time, a lot of patience, to get to where you want to be. A lot of time, because all of that takes time to come to fruition. You have to plan, you have to strategize, from an operational standpoint, from a marketing standpoint, from a sales standpoint. And you made a very good point that I wanted to touch upon, is that a lot of entrepreneurs, small businesses in the beginning, max out line of credit as opposed to kind of like front loading that cash because they're paying for too many things. as opposed to really focusing on sales. Because let's face it, without sales, you don't have a business. And when you have more sales, then you have access to more cash flow, whether it comes in now or later, and that really helps you, from a scalability standpoint. Um, have you seen any specific industries, that might have, more opportunities or might be more successful in your experience, that you've worked with versus others?
Oh, that's a tough question because so much of it comes down to the specific business and the
Mm,
specific market and the skills of the founder or the founders. So the barriers to entry are certainly much lower in a lot of service businesses. You don't need a lot of capital to start most service businesses.
yeah,
So you see a lot of startups in the services space, right? It takes a lot more capital to start a construction or a real estate business typically. And so part of it comes down to what are the financial resources of the founders and where do their skills and experience lie, where they're most likely
right.
to be successful.
Right. That's a really good point. And the reason I asked is because, I am in a service based industry. And I remember 3, 4 years ago when I was starting my business, is that I was looking for, some startup capital. I was looking at some investors, seeing anybody that would be interested in investing into a digital marketing business. And you're probably person number, I don't know, 100,568 that kind of validated the fact that you don't need really, any capital. Like you said, the barrier of entry is so low. And that's why I asked the question, because I think a lot of different industries and verticals really vary in terms of barrier of entry, in terms of how much upfront cash flow that you need. I think that's the beauty about, at least for, like the marketing space, is just that, there's a zero to very little upfront investment, as long as you have the technical agility and creativity, and of course, seasonality and experience that can really contribute to, hey, I can really get this going with little or nothing. But at some point, nonetheless, because I've thought about this, now also having a full time employee, is that, all right, I'm scaling, I'm wanting to grow the business. Now, hence why I asked the question a little bit ago, is just that at what point does it make sense to really start thinking about like the long term investment and the planning and the business model? Because if I want to grow, then I know at some point I need to look into doing something like that. Because I look at family, for instance, or other people I've worked with in the past, in my agency days specifically. And I've seen those guys make those mistakes. Like, they didn't plan. They're even 10 years in, and they're making millions of dollars per year, and they have maybe 10, 20, 30 employees, 40, 50 or more, and they still really haven't kind of invested into this holistic approach, to define that business model, simply because I don't know if it's a lack of seeing the value in it or what. But the one thing I've noticed is that it has become very costly for them to operate as a business, because they don't really have like the pillars defined, and they really never invested into it. And I think that's the one thing that a lot of small businesses specifically fail to understand, is this, that if you don't establish those pillars, like you talked about, the operational side and the financial side, to help you scale, then it's going to take a long period of time before you actually bring a business to cash flow positive. And that's why I think I'm thinking of a specific former boss of mine, that does about 15 million per year, with his agency, and they're global, right? And they're doing fairly well, but it took 10 years to get to this point. And I think it's because you never really invested into what you were talking about, is like a financial operating system, and mapping out the path, and understanding that what, you have to invest into this for the long-term success of your business. Because if you don't, then it's actually going to be more costly for you in the long term.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that I see, and I've made this mistake myself many times, is
Mm-hmm.
trying to do too many things for too many different kinds of clients and not having that focus. So we can spread ourselves really thin, trying to do all different kinds of services for all different kinds of clients and all different kinds of industries. You might be really smart and you can figure out how to do that, but when you hire a team and you try to standardize the operations, the whole company is not as agile and flexible and probably smart as you as the founder. And so the need to standardize is key to being able to scale. So it becomes repeatable and scalable, and every project is not its own snowflake. And so that's, definitely ties straight back into the financial metrics, because if to the extent the operations are, not standardized, then it becomes a lot more expensive to manage and deliver and quality control and all of that.
Sure. You mentioned one thing that actually earlier I wanted to touch upon is just that being selective about your client base. And that's ultimately what I personally am going through right now is just because I know in the 4 years, there's been a lot that I have learned, a lot. And I guess I've in a way been fortunate enough that, my father is also a fellow entrepreneur who runs a business, and he's kind of, learned through the school of hard knocks, so to speak. And as you were pointing out specifically being selective about your clients, because nowadays I really hyper focus on that. I look for certain qualities and traits. It's usually clients that I can build likability with, clients that see value in what I have to offer, that's specifically applicable to their own unique problems, not just any problem, because I think every business has a unique set of problems. And also being able to build that trust. These are ultimately the three things that I've kind of mapped out: is likability, trust, and value. The fourth one, of course, is persuasion, because you still have to persuade people, to do business with you. But I think that, if likability and trust and value are established, and that has been proven actually over the last 2 years based on the types of clients that I attracted. And that really got me thinking back to what you were saying, is that, not everyone's going to be your client. You don't want everybody to be your client. But I think that in the early days as an entrepreneur, as a small business, you're thinking cash flow. You're thinking, where is money going to come from? So you're kind of like a little bit desperate about,
Yes,
okay,
you're
I'm
not
going to,
very picky.
exactly, you're not, and let's face it, it's slim picking in the beginning, because, like you said, in the service, especially in the service-based industry, most companies don't see capital, upfront capital for operational purposes, right? Some do, but it's a very, very small percentage. And so you're kind of like going out there. I'm like, okay, I'm going to build a huge client base, and that's going to bring me cash flow. And that's actually, I've learned that to be a very ineffective way of doing it, because when you attract everybody, then you're spreading yourself too thin, because not everybody's going to see value in what you have to offer. And so long term, that's exactly what I'm focusing on, is just that, I would rather have, less than a handful of clients. They're very dedicated, very focused, they understand the importance of long-term investment, than have more than two hands full of client and have a lot of hand holding and feel like I have to sell them every single day so they can see the value in what I have to offer. And I've been there before. I've been there before. Like, whether it's someone that said, "Hey, can you help me with social media, or building a website, or paid advertising?" It's like, "Yeah, great, I'll help you." Then you get into the actual, work, and then you find out a month into it, you're like, "Well, shit, like, this really isn't a good fit," Like, it's like a million questions. And so it really kind of borderlines with the profitability, because if you're spending too much time on communication, project management, and not enough time on execution, that it's taken away from you being able to chip away at, that promise that you've made, that scope of work that you've made to a client. And that has been a hard lesson that I have learned. And so it was very interesting. You mentioned that, it's not everyone, will be your client, nor do you want everybody to be your client. Um, well, Cal, I really enjoyed the conversation. You mentioned so many different things here, that entrepreneurs that are early in the game, that need to consider, the long-term benefit. You also talked about the importance of having a team, someone like you and your team that can come in, that has seasonality and experience in a proven system, such as the financial operating system, to help guide them for long-term success. Before we sign off, let's throw out some links, social handles. What's the best way for listeners to connect with you out there?
Yeah, so probably the number one way is to visit my company's website, smartbooks.com, and there's a link there for a free consultation. Certainly you can put my name in there if you want to talk to me personally, and we'll figure out what you need and how SmartBooks may be able to help guide you through getting control over your business finances. Or even if we're not a fit at SmartBooks, we can point you in the right direction.
Awesome. Cal, I want to thank you so much for jumping on the podcast and sharing all the great insight, that is 100% applicable to any small business, really.
Great. Well, thank you, Ivan. It's been great speaking with you.